Hello and welcome to my latest project. I finally decided to paint the first object I ever printed. As I didn't know what I was doing, the rear of the model is lacking in detail because that's where I put all the supports, but as I'm only going to look at this bust from the front, it has all the detail I need. In practicing with my 3D printer, I've realised everything needs to be printed diagonally to reduce the layer lines that can be seen on my model. So for this model, I just covered it in several layers of paint. Although they're slightly visible after the 3 layers, when I finished with all the weathering, they're hardly visible at all. As you can see, I like to paint the model with all of the base colours first. This helps me understand if the colours go together, seeing as I don't really know how a colour wheel works. My usual style of painting is quite dark, so for this model I try to lighten my approach. This time round, instead of adding shadows and highlights to the base colour, I just made the base colour the shadow tone. For the bone on the bust, I am actually using a Vallejo recipe from the special effects paint set. Annoyingly, you will have to buy the dead flesh green in a separate set. To achieve the shadow tone for the bones, a mixture of 2/3 green and 1/3 white is used. I'm also still trying to get through my Citadel paints, so the horns will be coated in Rakarath flesh. I used this with Agrax Earthshade on miniatures to make convincing bone texture. A dark grey is used for the belt, which only leaves the rest of the areas to be covered in metallic paints. Owning a lot of metallic paints saves me from the pain of trying to learn to paint non-metallic metals. The darkest metallic I own is gunmetal grey, so I use that as a base tone. As fortune would have it, my inexperience with printing has provided me with an opportunity. The layer lines on the metallic on his chest plate looks like Damascus steel. When seeing this, a little plan formulated in my head, but I'll get to that later. When painting the bronze on the side of the helmet, I gently applied the paint with the side of the brush to prevent it getting into all the little creases, giving it a sort of inlay effect on the metallics. With all the base colour set down, it's time for texturing. As I'm very random in my approach, I decided to do the leather belt first. My own leather recipe is to darken some orange with grey and apply it to the edges of a dark grey base to imitate the wear on the leather. After painting fine lines across the belt as well, I highlight some of the darker orange with the brighter orange. For me, that's all I need to do to make leather. Using these progressively lighter browns, I'll create a convincing leather effect on the leather armour. It's only recording this I've realised I've made 2 different types of leather. So for my new recipe of leather, I'll be using a sponge to apply texture to the other leather. I'll be using the darkest of the 3 browns first, although lighter than the base colour of course, to start the process. For a pro tip, you can make the sponge smaller for smaller areas. I always find the first time I use sponge chipping, the first press on the model is always too hard. This can be rectified if you're a muppet like me by going over it with the original base colour to tone down the mistake. When applying the next lightest brown, I use a more direct approach using the brush. As the lighter the colour, the more worn the area. This will be focused more on areas that have damage or will see more wear and tear. I don't use reference pictures, but maybe you should. As for the lightest colour, which is almost white, is used for areas that receive the most wear and tear, most notably scratches and cuts. The only real advice I could give to this method is to try and be as random as possible, and to make sure the lighter the colour, the less area you cover. Looking at the result, you might be thinking, that's not leather. But I've got oil paints, and oil paints are the king in painting. Easy to blend, easy to clean off, and probably easy to something or other. Apparently sets of 3s is good, but I couldn't think of the 3rd. So with the oil paint thinned with the correct chemicals, it's time to apply it on top of the leather. I have made sure to thin the oil paint heavily, as I would rather glaze the areas several times rather than apply too much the first time round. When each layer has dried thoroughly, I can decide if the effect is right or add the next layer of glaze. When I believe I'm very close to the final colour I want, I add the glaze and let it pool in all the deepest recesses. This is only to reinforce the darkest shadows as all I'll be doing for this leather texture is applying highlights later. The effect that you see here took 6 to 7 layers of glaze. As I already had the oil paints out, I also textured the tips of the horns. Again, because I cannot focus on one task at a time, my attention turned to the green shirt. To apply texture and highlights to the shirt, I got my hog hair paintbrushes, as well as finding 3 greens that are lighter than my original base colour to start the texturing process. For this method, it's important to water the paint down about 50% to help it flow properly and not to cover too deeply in colour, as the hog hair brushes will be used to stipple the paint onto the cloth. Now, I must admit, as I'm recording this, I realised I could have just used the sponge chipping method. I don't know why I used the brushes, but let's try and put a positive spin on this. If your wife doesn't like you using her sponges for your paint projects, shave your pet pig and use its hairs for a brush. Stipple the progressively greener and lighter colours onto the areas that receive more light to build up the illusion of a texture on a volumetric surface. And if you shaved a cow, that will be known as bullshit. Using the lightest colour, highlighting the edges of the fabric, will create the illusion of the most wear and tear, and applying it to the highest areas of the cloth will fake the light bouncing off of it. Now it's time to show you that a recipe always fails. I use Rakaraf Flesh and Agrax Earthshade for bone on nearly all of my miniatures, and it always works, but this is a clear demonstration. Even if you know it works, it'll fail badly. This is why if you copy something on YouTube, it never works. And I've tried copying many things off YouTube for painting and have never managed to actually make any of it work. But of course, if you copy what I'm doing, it's going to work perfectly. So ignore everybody else. My method is foolproof. But seriously, whatever you see other people doing, as well as myself, just take it as a pinch of salt, or guidelines really. I'll talk through how I did the bone texture and highlights in a second, but I've watched hundreds if not thousands of tutorials on how to paint this, that and the other, and while watching them I didn't even paint, and even when I did, I only ended up comparing myself to the professionals, which only led into ultimate disappointment in my final results. Now personally, I do not see myself as a professional, and I know I'm trying to make content on how to paint, but the way that I broke out of the vicious cycle that I was in was actually to stop watching the professionals and just start painting myself. This has actually resulted in me being much happier with the final result in my paint jobs and helped me with the actual enjoyment of painting again. But I digress. What you do to paint bone is to progressively lighten the green colour and apply on smaller and smaller highlights. Again, this is only the base tone. You have to wait for the inks to finish the job. Now, seeing as I am actually a muppet in painting, I don't know why I painted the inside of the mouth. So after repainting it dark grey again, I used more of the crappy Citadel paint to recoat the horns. Now it's time for my favourite inks. Creating washes of brown, blue and green. I don't have green, so I mix blue and yellow. Simples. It's time to apply random splodges all over the skull and bones, making sure the brown is in the shadow areas and applying the blues and greens in random areas to create a dead rotting sort of look. If you add water to inks, they become very translucent. You can have fun and play quite a lot without worrying too much that you're going to screw something up. They're great for adding subtle changes in colour and shades with absolutely no effort. But I will warn you, if you don't water these things down, they are very pigment heavy. They stain even on touch, and a little bit of acrylic ink goes a very long way. Once you're finally happy with how you've stained your skull or bones, going back over the highlights with your lightest colour but not white is recommended. I also reinforced the scratches in the helmet using a lighter colour as well. Now this next bit is actually going to wind up one of my friends. Not the fake friend that buys me special pieces. Damascus steel. I realised dry brushing silver over the completely intentional layer lines makes for a completely simple Damascus steel. The only fine lines I need to paint with the silver is along all the bottom edges of the deepest scratches and dents. See, if you do everything like I did, Damascus steel is easy. Now it's time for the pot of no, just get rid of that. I'm just going to use the original umber ink for the horn texture. I did apply multiple coats, but at least I get to control how dark it becomes. Again, I made sure that I pulled it in all the cracks and creases. And again, almost like I think I've repeated myself before, I used the oil paints to darken the tips of the horns. This time actually being happy with the darkness of the horns, not being the same colour as the leather of the helmet, I used the original colour for the highlights. For the scratches in the horns, I used a brighter colour. My wife couldn't find a tartan paint for the cloak, so I had to refer to powerful reference pictures like this to recreate it. To break down the reference photos I had, painting a dark grey grid pattern helped to paint tartan. Now, the easiest way I'm going to explain this is to paint diagonal lines of dark grey in the areas that need to be black, but paint them right to left if you're going horizontal and left to right if you're going to vertical. This way the crossing points will be much darker. Again, not using the multiple sponges that I have around me, it's time to highlight all the raised edges with a brighter red colour. This will help tone down the darker colours and reinforce the lighter colours. To complete the pattern for tartan, it's quite simple. All that's needed is to draw straight lines horizontal and vertically, using whichever the colours you feel like. I used white and yellow. White for the centre line and yellow for the edges of the black. I did personally forget to water down the paint, so it did come out quite blotchy. I suggest you thin it out with a little bit of water first. But off camera I just used the base colours to tighten up the lines. Now for the glowing eyes. I base coated them in the brightest white I own, as well as the sockets. Then painted the eyeballs with the fluorescent green paint. With water I then thinned down that same paint to apply thin layers into the sockets of the eye sockets. This saved me from firing up my airbrush just to paint the eyes. That's OSL paintbrush style. Even if you've got the equipment, doesn't mean you have to use it. Anyway, for the rust and verdigris, I watered down the Vallejo special effects paints and applied it in all the areas that I thought water would collect in. Normally you would apply chipping fluid on top of the metallic paint and then apply the verdigris paint, wiping it off with water for chipping effect. But for this project I thought it was simpler just to apply it to the areas that I wanted it. Once I was happy with the verdigris, I turned my attention to the rust colour. This particular effect does have pigments and little bits and bobs inside to create tiny little textures of rust, but they didn't show because I believe they all fell into all the little layer lines that were in my model. Again, another tip that I will try and share with you is that if you've already done your edge highlighting and applied the effects, is to go back and reinforce all those edges. Even if you haven't hit those edges with any of the washes or effects, somehow, and I don't know how, it does seem to exaggerate the effect, and only in a good way. So remember, all you paintbrush holders, practice edging, and then practice edging again. Maybe until you go blind and can't see those edges anymore. Hang on a minute. What I'm trying to say is, when tidying up your weathering effects, staring at the metallics can make you go a little bit blind. I like to leave it and look at it the next day and then tidy it up with a fresh pair of eyes. Talking about eyes, I wasn't happy with the glowing eyes on my bust. There wasn't any real definition between the eyeballs and the socket, so I applied some AK Interactive neutral grey enamel. This helped to separate the eyeball from the socket, and using enamel thinners made the cleanup easier than using acrylics. To complete the eyes, all that was needed was a bright white specular highlight in the top right of the eyeball. Now this is one of those sort of things that works very well in person but not very well on camera because of how cameras focus and perceive light. I mixed 3 iridescent transparent metallic inks which actually change colour depending on which direction you look at them, but wouldn't really actually show on camera, to paint the magical medallion holding the cloak together. Look, this warrior's alive, it needs magic. To finish the medallion, I used gold paint in all the recesses in the edges. I thought at this point that the model was finished. The problem is, every time I looked at it, something seemed missing. When I realised I'd weathered everything apart from the cloth, I broke out all the enamel paints again. AK Interactive to the rescue. Now I found when using the AK Interactive enamel paints, well I mean the dirt and grime effects paints, is that it's best to apply the darkest paint first, blend it out, and then apply the lightest paint, blend that one out, leaving no straight or harsh edges, go straight back to the darkest paint again and apply another layer on top, and of course blend it out, apply the lighter colour again, blend that one out again, and keep repeating and repeating until you're happy with the final outcome. Now I can't stress enough that enamels and oils are quite scary to get into if you're only used to painting with acrylics. But I left this model for a few days while I was on holiday, and on coming back I realised I'd overdone the dirt effect. I simply used my enamel thinner to tone down the effect and remove the paint that I didn't want. This wouldn't have happened if I was using acrylic paint. I'd have to repaint the entire area. For the tartan cloak, obviously a brown colour wouldn't work, so a green mossy colour it had to be. The light slimy green colour wasn't light enough, so I broke out my chalks and scraped some into the mix. After applying the lighter colour on top of the darker enamels, it was a simple process of adding yellow and white chalk to make the green even lighter. The next problem that I found to solve was the difference between the cloak and the green shirt. They still looked like the same material, so I decided to use the dark grey enamel paint to create a fake shadow, or what I would call panel lining. This helped to separate the two materials to make them look that they weren't one and the same. And as they're enamel paints, a simple little bit of white spirit helps clean up all the little areas that I made mistakes on. For the base I used a cheap acrylic paint. I don't remember this. Breathing in enamel thinners might not be good for you. So paint the cork black. Sorry, not cork, plinth. So when all that's done, the skeleton wants to say hello. I'd love to know your feedback. Let me know what I've done right. Let me know what I've done wrong. I'm all ears. Now, if you made it this far, all I'd like to say is thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed and have fun.